Imagine a dog named Bear. And Bear is a Doberman. And Bear loves two things in this world: playing hard and dinner time. But here's the strange part. Every single time someone brings out his food bowl, every time the excitement peaks, Bear's legs will buckle. His head drops. For a few seconds, he simply collapses, fully conscious, fully aware, watching his own dinner, but unable to move a muscle. This dog, Bear, is one of a colony of narcoleptic Dobermans studied at Stanford. They helped crack open one of the great mysteries of modern neuroscience. Because what was happening to Bear's brain in that moment of collapsing is happening right now in an exam room across the world. These are patients who fall asleep mid-sentence. It's the ones who describe brain fog that no antidepressant seems to touch. And the ones who tell you, almost embarrassed, that strong emotion, laughter, surprise, makes their knees give out. The molecule responsible has one of the more poetic names in pharmacology. It's called Orexin. And today, we're going to spend some time talking about it. Well, folks, welcome back to Positive Psychiatry with Rakesh Jain. I'm, of course, Rakesh, your host. And if you are a regular listener, you know that the show lives at the intersection of hard neuroscience and the actual patient sitting across from us in clinic. Today's topic sits exactly at that intersection. And honestly, it's one I've been wanting to tell this story to you for a while, because the timing could not be better. We're talking about Orexin. It used to be called hypocretin, but pretty much we have settled on this name. All right, so here's our roadmap. First, I want to tell you the discovery story, and it's really quite a cool story, worthy of Hollywood, Bollywood. It's a scientific race story, a colony of narcoleptic dogs. And there are twists and turns in this story. Second, we will build the neurobiology from the ground up. Where do these orexin neurons live? What do their receptors do? And what a beautifully simple model for how our brain decides moment to moment whether to be asleep or awake. And third, we go clinical. Narcolepsy and a genuinely historic FDA approval that happened just a few days ago. And fourth, we flip the molecule around and we talk about insomnia too. The drug class built to block orexin instead of boost it. So either way, clinically, to boost orexin and its functioning or to inhibit its functioning can lead in appropriate patients to helping them. And finally, of course, the part I and you care most about, we talk about orexin's emerging role in depression and anxiety and addiction and perhaps even wellness, because this system reaches far beyond sleep medicine and into the core of what we treat every day. So this conversation, I hope, will be scientific, useful, and let's get into it. Let's go back to 1998. That wasn't that long ago, was it? That was just 28 years ago. And here's where the story gets interesting, because there are two separate laboratories, not collaborating, not even aware of exactly how close the other was. But they were both closing in on the same discovery from two completely different directions. Here in Texas, at the University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas, Takeshi Sakurai and colleagues were doing what's called reverse pharmacology. They had a receptor with no known partner, what scientists often call an orphan receptor, sitting on the surface of cells in the hypothalamus. They didn't know what turned it on. So they went looking for the key that fit this lock. What they found was a small peptide. And when they injected it into rats, the rats ate a lot. So they named it after the Greek word orexis, which means appetite. So they named it Orexin. At almost the exact same time, a team at Scripps Research, which is in San Diego, La Jolla, San Diego, led by Louis D'Alessia and colleagues, found the very same molecule through a completely different technique, one designed to fish out genes expressed specifically in the hypothalamus. They noticed their peptide had a structure a little like incretin hormones from the gut. So they called it hypocretin, because hypothalamus plus incretin. Now here's the thing. They're exactly the same molecule. Two names published within about a month of each other in 1998. And to this day, both names survive in the literature, which is why you'll still see hypocretin 1 on a cerebrospinal fluid lab report, even though most of us today say orexin. I think we ought to settle on the word orexin. The FDA certainly did. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because appetite was only the first incomplete answer to what this molecule actually does. So let's go back to 1970s, 20-some years before the discovery of orexin. Again, back to Stanford and Dr. William Dement's sleep laboratory. And Dement is one of the founding fathers of sleep medicine. In fact, I have one of his books right here at home. He's one of the founding fathers of sleep medicine. He had a colony of dogs, Bear the Doberman, I mentioned at the very top of this podcast, among them, that had a spontaneous inherited form of narcolepsy. These dogs would be playing or approaching food and then collapse, wide awake, but the muscles just have no more tone. That's called cataplexy, and we define it precisely in a moment or two. For 20 years, nobody knew why. Then in about 1999, a researcher in that same Stanford lineage, Emmanuel Mignot, M-I-G-N-O-T, or sometimes also pronounced Mignot, found it. I have had the pleasure of meeting this gentleman, and he's quite a wonderful person and quite a character. He identified a mutation in the gene, the dogs, and it's called CANARC1. And when they sequenced it, it actually turned out to encode for orexin type 2 receptor. So think about the sequence of events. One molecule discovered twice, initially thought to be about appetite. Then within about 18 months, a canine sleep disorder traced directly back to the mutated orexin receptor, and almost simultaneously, orexin knockout mice, which is a pretty fancy way of saying these mice are bred and engineered with no orexin at all, were shown to have spontaneous behavioral arrest, very similar to human cataplexy. So now we have 3 independent lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion within about 2 years. This molecule wasn't primarily about appetite. It was about the stability of wakefulness itself. And then, as the story unfolds, my dear friends, then came the human confirmation. And this is the part I find genuinely moving as a clinician. In the year 2000, Mignot's group measured orexin in the cerebrospinal fluid of people with narcolepsy. In the form that we now call narcolepsy type 1, the orexin was almost completely gone, undetectable, in fact, in most cases. Now, unlike the dogs, human narcolepsy type 1, also sometimes called NT1, is essentially never caused by a receptor mutation. It's in fact caused by the loss of neurons that make orexin in the first place. Though what we now understand, it's actually an autoimmune process, selectively destroying somewhere between 10 and 70,000 orexin-producing neurons in the hypothalamus, We will come back to exactly how we think this happens because there's a fascinating and clinically important detail involving a flu vaccine used in Europe. But you know what? First, we got to build the actual neurobiology story because one cannot understand the clinical picture without understanding the wiring. So now in the next section, we will talk about neurobiology, focusing on anatomy, receptors, and the flip-flop switch. You heard me right, flip-flop switch. So let's start with the real estate, okay? Orexin neurons are not spread diffusely throughout the brain. In fact, they live in a remarkably small, specific address, the lateral hypothalamus and the perifornical area immediately around it. So the lateral hypothalamus and the perifornical area around it are really the homes. They're the ground center for orexin neurons. So in humans, we're talking about a population in the order of just 50 to 80,000 neurons. That's really tiny by brain standards. Well, remember, the brain has several billion neurons. 50 to 80,000 is not even a rounding error. But man, these neurons matter because what these neurons lack in number, they make up for in reach. From that small hypothalamic address, these orexin receptors project almost everywhere that matters for arousal, for wakefulness. So it goes to the locus coeruleus, which is the brain's main noradrenergic engine. It also goes to the dorsal raphe nucleus, which is the source of serotonergic output. The tuberomammillary nucleus, the brain's histamine center. The ventral tegmental area, which is central to dopaminergic reward circuits. And of course, also to the basal forebrain cortex and the cholinergic and GABAergic populations of the brainstem that regulate REM sleep. Good Lord, good heavens. So from one single 50 to 80,000 neuron center in the brain, which is, seriously, when the brain looks at 50 to 80,000, it goes, come on now. But these orexin receptors, because of their reach into norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, GABA, and glutamate, profoundly control our wakefulness as well as our sleep. Now let's get a little bit geeky because structurally from one gene, and that gene is called preproorexin, so both preproorexin, the body cleaves two active peptides. Those are called orexin A. It's about 33 amino acids long, and orexin B, which is 28 amino acids long. Now, orexin A is remarkably stable. Orexin B is more like a straightened out cousin of the same molecule. Now, these two peptides act on two receptors, and here's the detail that actually matters clinically, because it'll explain to us why some drugs are selective and others aren't. So orexin receptor type 1, you will see that referenced in the literature as OX1R, strongly prefers orexin A. It drives excitation. Orexin receptor type 2, you will see this referenced repeatedly as OX2R, binds both orexin A and orexin B with about equal affinity and couples through multiple pathways. Why does this matter? Because it turns out the OX2R is the dominant player in maintaining wakefulness and suppressing REM sleep intrusion, which is exactly why, as we will see shortly, the newest generation of narcolepsy drugs, they are built to selectively activate OX2R rather than both receptors indiscriminately. Now, here's the concept I most want you to check it out with me because it's genuinely one of the more elegant models in behavioral neuroscience. And it comes to us from another pioneer in the world of sleep-wake research by the name of Clifford Saper and colleagues. And it's called the flip-flop switch model of sleep-wake regulation. So picture two mutually antagonistic circuits. Okay? Mutually antagonistic. On one side, the wake-promoting circuit, this would be our monoaminergic and cholinergic arousal centers. But on the other side, on the flip-flop, is the sleep-promoting circuit, centered on a small cluster called the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, or VLPO. These two sides actively inhibit each other. So when the wake circuits are firing, they suppress the VLPO. Conversely, when the VLPO is firing, guess what? It suppresses the wake circuits. This is cool, right? This is like teeter-totter. If one side is up, the other's down, and vice versa. Just visualize that in your brain. Two children sitting on a teeter-totter. One is up, one is down. On a teeter-totter, both children cannot be both up at the same time or both down at the same time. You get it, right? That's exactly what's happening in our brain. It's quite literally a switch, folks. And like any other switch built on mutual inhibition, is designed to snap decisively into one state or the other, rather than hover uncertainly in between. Think again about teeter-totter. This design is elegant. Nature has done a fabulous job. Congratulations, dear nature. But it does have a vulnerability. A switch with no stabilizing mechanism is prone to flickering, rapid involuntary transitions back and forth. And this is where orexin comes in. So orexin neurons don't act as one side of the switch. They act as the hand steadying the switch, reinforcing whatever state the system has committed to, and critically, suppressing REM-generating circuits during wakefulness so that REM sleep phenomena like muscle atonia, which is like your muscles becoming really flaccid, don't intrude while we are awake. Because when I'm awake, I need my muscles to have tone. But when I'm in my REM sleep, I want to be, really, those muscles are totally flat out paralyzed. So that's all good. But if you take the orexin away and the switch still exists, guess what? It becomes very unstable. Wakefulness collapses abruptly into sleep-like states. Think about Bear. Think about our patients with narcolepsy. REM-associated muscle atonia leaks into full consciousness. This instability is what we call narcolepsy. We just are now understanding it at a circuit level. I want you to hold on to that image. Orexin as the stabilizing hand on the switch, because everything clinical we discussed for the rest of this episode is really just different ways of asking, what happens when that hand gets weaker? And what happens when we deliberately make it stronger or weaker with the drug? Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's put this model to clinical use, starting with narcolepsy type 1, because a drug just got approved that just made history. Let's talk a little bit about narcolepsy type 1, or also known as NT1. NT1 is defined by two things: excessive daytime sleepiness and cataplexy. You got it? Excessive daytime sleepiness and cataplexy. Why don't we define cataplexy precisely? Because it's frequently misdiagnosed as a seizure or a psychogenic event. Cataplexy is a sudden, brief loss of muscle tone that's typically triggered by a strong, positive emotion, laughter, while consciousness is fully preserved. And what it is, from a mechanistic perspective, an intrusion of REM sleep muscle atonia, which pretty much means no tone, into wakefulness states. Remember Bear the Doberman collapsing at the sight of his food bowl that he had been looking forward to all day? Same phenomena translated into a human nervous system. Patients also frequently describe hypnagogic hallucinations, sleep paralysis, and fragmented nighttime sleep, which is a detail I want to underline for a psychiatric audience like you and I, because narcolepsy is not simply, quote, too much daytime sleep, end quote. The nighttime is shot too, folks. Nighttime sleep is very disrupted. The whole 24-hour day architecture is destabilized. Not good. The underlying pathology, as we discussed, is in fact an autoimmune destruction of the orexin-producing neurons, typically more than 90% loss. And there's a striking piece of history here. A cluster of narcolepsy cases in part of Europe followed the H1N1 pandemic of 2009, because what that did is link to a particular vaccination formulation used there. The leading hypothesis is that molecular mimicry and immune response is genetically, in people who are genetically susceptible, it cross-reacted with orexin neurons themselves, and it remains one of the more compelling natural experiments linking infection, immunity, and a specific neuronal population. Now, for decades, everything we had to treat narcolepsy type 1 was symptomatic. We used stimulants. We used wake-promoting agents. Modafinil, armodafinil, sodium oxybate, all good drugs. But they were only treating symptoms. Then we used pitolisant, which works one step downstream of orexin on histamine H3 receptors. But all of these are treating the symptoms of this condition. They're not actually treating the condition. None of them replace what's actually missing. All this changed on August 5th, 2026, because the FDA approved a drug called oveporexton, 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 and its brand name is Orziful, Orzeyful, for narcolepsy type 1 in adults. Now, this is the first orexin receptor agonist ever approved, and it is an oral twice-daily medication. It is selective for OX2R, so it's selective for orexin 2 receptor, and it's designed to do the one thing no prior narcolepsy treatment could do, that being directly restore orexin receptor signaling. Think about what this means for the flip-flop switch model we just built. Every prior narcolepsy treatment worked around the missing hand on the switch, which is propping up wakefulness with stimulants or dampening down fragmented sleep with sodium oxybate. Now, this particular molecule, this particular new approval by the FDA is actually designed to put a hand back on the switch. So, what was the data that backed this up? Well, it rested on 2 12-week placebo-controlled trials in adults with narcolepsy type 1, showing improvement across both daytime wakefulness and cataplexy, meaning, notably, benefit across the full symptom complex of the disease, not just one piece of it. The most common side effect that I saw in these papers: insomnia, urinary urgency, hypersalivation, which, if you think about the OX2R's broad distribution beyond just the arousal circuit, makes physiological sense. One more detail worth knowing, because patients will ask: we will not yet have commercial availability till the DEA scheduling determination happens, which takes about 90 days or so. Okay, now that we have talked a little bit about orexin receptor 2 agonist, I think we need to talk about the other side of the story. Let's flip the whole story around. Because if losing orexin signaling causes pathological sleepiness, what happens if one deliberately, pharmacologically turns it down? In someone who has plenty of orexin, perhaps even too much, but whose arousal system simply won't power down at night. See, that's the logic behind an entirely new class of medications that we have been using for a while, called the dual orexin receptor antagonists, or DORA. So they are currently on the market. We call them suvorexton. Brand name is Belsomra. That was approved in 2014. Lemborexton. Dayvigo. That came in 2019. And then came daridorexton, Quivivik. That arrived in 2022. All three block both the orexin 1 and orexin 2 receptors, reducing that wake-promoting signal at night, so the flip-flop switch can settle into sleep more readily, rather than, as sedative hypnotic classes do, like benzos and Z-drugs, globally suppressing central nervous system activity through GABA-A potentiation. Now, this mechanistic distinction is clinically meaningful because DORAs work by removing a wake-promoting signal rather than broadly sedating the brain. And they're generally shown to have a more favorable profile on the next-day residual effects, and the abuse liability, while not zero, appears to be diminished. So yes, that's something that we need to know. Folks, I've been watching even further refinement on this. So DORAs, of course, block both receptors, right? Orexin 1 and 2. But seltorexant, which is a blocker of just orexin 2 receptors, just orexin 2, is currently being studied to be used in patients with major depression. And we will, of course, talk much more about that when the time is right. So for the time being, just be aware that DORAs, the three that I just mentioned to you, have been available actually for some years now. It's also really important to remember that further refinement is occurring in a class called SORAs, S-O-R-A. What does that stand for? Selective orexin receptor antagonist. And seltorexant is one molecule that I would urge you to keep your eyes on, because in patients with mood difficulties, to be able to block the orexin 2 receptor may in fact come with benefits not just in sleep, but perhaps even in the neuroimmune system and perhaps even the HPA axis system, because as we well know, patients with depression who have untreated sleep difficulties fundamentally are impaired at the brain-body level. Now, let's do this, folks. Let's talk about what matters to all of us in psychiatry, MDs, DOs, NPs, PAs, RNs, social workers, therapists, you name it. Let's talk about that. Let's remember, orexin neurons don't just project to the arousal centers. They project heavily into the ventral tegmental area, VTA, the core reward circuitry. And their firing is strongly modulated by stress and emotional resilience and reward predicting cues. Now, in animal models, orexin neuron activity rises with stressors and drug-associated cues. And blocking orexin signaling has been shown to blunt drug seeking and reinstatement of behavior that's actually beneficial across multiple substance of abuse. So this gives rise to a real ongoing investigation of orexin antagonism as a potential tool for addiction psychiatry. No, we don't yet have an approved indication, but this is a genuinely active area of research linked to arousal circuitry, directly helping patients who are challenged by cravings and relapse. Now let's do this. Let's particularly consider depression, major depression. And of course, we know there's prominent insomnia and hyperarousal, both. The insomnia is in sleep, but the hyperarousal is in everything in their body. There's a compound that we just talked about, seltorexant, which is the OX2R, orexin 2 receptor antagonist, and is currently in phase 3 development as an adjunctive treatment for major depressive disorder. I want to flag this so that we can, over time, keep our eyes on it, because mechanistically the hypothesis is elegant as all get out. If there is nighttime hyperarousal, partly driven by excess orexin signaling, well, let's then block the orexin. But careful, blocking the orexin 1 receptor, not so helpful. In fact, it can rebound and create more troubles for the patient. Well, what's the thoughtful clinician to do? Well, we should be thinking about blocking the appropriate receptor in this situation, which is not orexin 1 and 2, it's just orexin 2. I think this should establish for us that we should think about orexin more broadly. It's not simply a sleep molecule or a wakefulness molecule. It is all that. But it really is a salience stabilizing system, and that the sleep-wake regulation is simply the most visible expression of it. So yes, these molecules, if we use them correctly, so for example, blocking orexin receptors does help with sleep. The data is really, we can't even argue with that. That's really very good. We have 3 approved FDA treatments. We also have a treatment that's coming online, one hopes, that is specifically for one of the 2 receptors in the orexin family in seltorexant. But we need to celebrate the fact that we now have an orexin agonist, the opposite of an antagonist, in order to help people in a manner that we're not simply treating the symptoms of the disorder, but in fact treating the entirety of the disorder. This brings to mind something that is so very interesting. So we've spent decades organizing our field around different neurotransmitter systems, haven't we? Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, glutamate, GABA, acetylcholine. We neatly put them in different buckets, but orexin doesn't fit neatly into that lineup because it isn't really a mood molecule or a sleep molecule in isolation. It's more a coordinating signal molecule. It sits upstream to these multiple neurotransmitter systems. It tunes arousal, tunes salience, stabilizes the whole system across different states. And that's precisely why a single hypothalamic peptide discovered by 2 labs chasing appetite and gene expression completely reshaped our understanding of narcolepsy, insomnia, and possibly depression and anxiety and addiction. Now you see, don't you, why I so badly wanted to talk to you about all the developments in the orexin system. Now let's bring all this back to the clinic. So I have 4 takeaways. Takeaway 1. If a patient describes to us sudden brief muscle weakness that are often triggered by strong emotions, particularly laughter, alongside excessive daytime sleepiness, think narcolepsy type 1. Think about that, because in the vast majority of these patients who do come into the medical system, they're actually ignored. They're often called malingering or thought to have seizures or pseudo-seizures or a conversion disorder. Consider having a high degree of suspicion. Refer to a sleep medicine specialist if you're not one, but polysomnography for multiple sleep latency testing, and if indicated, for CSF hypocretin measurement. That's their specialty. They can take care of it. But none of this starts unless I alert the patient and the referral source that, hey, we need some help. Takeaway number 2. Know the new landscape. Things have really changed. As of this month, narcolepsy type 1 has, for the very first time, an FDA-approved treatment, oviparextin. Orzafol is designed to restore orexin signaling rather than simply manage symptoms. We're awaiting DEA scheduling, but this is a conversation we've been wanting to have with narcolepsy patients forever, and we're almost there. Number 3, when we're choosing among the DORA class of medications for insomnia, remember the mechanism we're leveraging. We're quieting the wake-promoting side of the flip-flop switch, not simply sedating the brain broadly. That distinction is worth explaining to patients directly because it often reduces fear of dependency and unrealistic expectations about how the medication should feel. Make sure you're also keeping your eyes on the SORA class, the selective orexin receptor antagonist, seltorexant being the one member of this class that is most further along. And finally, I want to leave you with this. Watch for continuing conversation on this because for all the right reasons, psychiatry is now firmly interested in a third of human life, which is sleep. But psychiatry has always been interested in the 2/3 of human life, which is wakefulness. And orexin is that one thread that binds both of these together. Right? Orexin, in many ways, is indispensable to our thinking as mental health professionals. So as we close, let's go back to Bear, the Doberman who started our conversation. Remember Bear? He would collapse at the sight of his dinner bowl. Well, it took 20 years and 2 competing labs and a colony of narcolepsy dogs and researchers. All of that, it took all that time, but look where we are here. The story of Orexin is now really mature. So a molecule discovered almost accidentally while looking for something about appetite, that turns out to be one of the brain's master switches for staying awake, staying asleep, staying calm, avoiding drugs, and possibly even, yes, wellness. Yes, this is why this conversation on positive psychiatry mandates that we talk about Orexin. Folks, this is Rakesh Jain, and I really thank you for spending so much time with me to talk about this remarkable molecule. Please stay curious, continue taking care of yourself and your patients, but most of all, I wish you and your patients great well-being and wellness. Goodbye for now.